Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Schmidt, and I'm the 743 Program Manager at Caltrans. With me in the room are members of the Caltrans Implementation Work Group, as well as representatives from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We have about 500 participants today, and everyone likely differs in their level of familiarity with SB 743, so bear with us as we get everyone up to speed. Today, we'll be discussing the effort by Caltrans to implement the requirements of changes brought about by SB 743. While Caltrans has embarked on this effort, I'd also like to acknowledge that local jurisdictions all over the states across the state are also working on implementation efforts, and we can all learn from each other. To be sure we can capture your questions, please use the chat feature throughout this webinar. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can during this 1-hour session. We will also send responses to all questions along with this presentation to all participants after the webinar. There will be future webinars to cover some of the specific topics identified today as well. So today we will cover the following topics: connecting the dots, really talking a little bit about the connection between SB 743 and climate change. What is SB 743? The Caltrans guidance documents that we're working on, and very importantly, responses to selected questions from you. So before getting into some of the details of the changes coming as a result of SB 743, I will provide a quick big picture overview of how we're aligning our environmental process with our priorities for fighting climate change and supporting state smart growth principles. The state is a global leader in the fight against the potential devastating effects of climate change. The state's vigorous measures to reduce harmful greenhouse gas emissions are comprehensive, extending from transitioning the electricity grid to 100% renewable energy to spurring investments that lead to more trips by walking, cycling, and public transportation, and less of Californians' time and money spent getting around. Many of these actions are part of the state's plan for meeting our climate goals, as set forth in the California Air Resource Board's 2017 Climate Change Scoping Plan. The Scoping Plan addresses transportation as one of the key sectors in which progress is essential to meeting climate goals. California is on track to meet the 2020 climate goals. This progress is largely a result of a dramatic increase in the use of renewable energy sources. To meet our 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goal of 40% below 1990 levels, reduction in the transportation sector emissions is essential. You've likely seen this pie chart before. Examined comprehensively, the transportation sector accounts for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. That includes about 40% from emissions from vehicles and 10% from refining transportation fuels. Better fuel efficiency, zero-emission vehicles, and cleaner fuels are central to transportation strategies in the scoping plan. However, these technology-based solutions will not be sufficient to meet the state's goals without a change in the way people and goods move around the state. Reducing our dependence on automobiles is also essential in reaching climate targets, and it will help meet our environmental, public health, and community goals as well. The requirements of SB 743 are part of a larger effort to reduce our dependence on cars by focusing on reducing vehicle miles traveled. Complementing these efforts in the transportation sector are state, regional, and local changes to community plan development patterns supporting California's smart growth principles. The implementation of SB 375, which requires each of the metropolitan planning organizations around the state to develop sustainable community strategies, are also integrating transportation, land use, and housing, and they serve as blueprints to achieve the emissions targets set for each region. Under SB 743, transportation agencies, regional agencies, and local governments are changing how we evaluate the transportation impacts of proposed projects by reorienting our evaluations to focusing on reducing automobile dependence. The changes alter the process of our California Environmental Quality Act reviews for both land use development and transportation projects. And I'm going to get back to that theme several times throughout this presentation. So in terms of desired outcomes, Implementing SB 743 is one part of a broader set of initiatives to get California on track so climate and environmental goals are achieved during a period of continued population and economic growth. The state has already demonstrated the ability for economic growth to occur at the same time as a reduced dependence on carbon use. This positive trend needs to be accompanied by meaningful improvements in the housing sector as well. SB 743 supports both of these changes with its focus on streamlining infill and transit-oriented development, supporting higher levels of walking and biking in transit, and an overall move away from auto dependence. The goals of cleaner air, better public health, and a multimodal transportation system are relevant everywhere in California. However, there are great differences between and within our cities, towns, and natural environments, and that means that solutions in one place won't necessarily work everywhere in the state. As we work to detail the ways in which SB 743 will be implemented by the department, we will be making every effort to understand potential impacts and solutions in different communities. Engaging with people representing the areas is already helping us to see distinct issues experienced in areas that are, for example, low growth and outside metropolitan planning organization boundaries. And we're actively working to understand how SB 743 will affect these areas. We're happy to hear from people who want to bring to our attention the unique circumstances and challenges that you face. So what's up with 743? Well, 743 really changed the California Environmental Quality Act and the specific requirement for the transportation analysis. As a result, the CEQA guidelines that are put out to implement the act have also been updated. Further, the Office of Planning and Research has put out a technical advisory that provides further guidance. And local agencies are also updating their own CEQA procedures, and a number of cities have already adopted those. For example, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose have already done so, and we can all learn from their example. So like other agencies, Caltrans is updating our CEQA procedures in our guidance documents. So what's our current focus in SB 743? And we'll get into some of the details here. Today we will cover some of the focus areas, and these include Caltrans procedures for review of local land use projects, Caltrans CEQA procedures for projects on the state highway system. So those are the key two areas, land use and the state highway system projects. So please note, we'll be discussing land use projects and transportation projects and switching back and forth, and this can cause some confusion, which I recognize and will emphasize throughout when I'm referring to the difference. We will also cover alignment with the CEQA required greenhouse gas emissions analysis and findings. And most importantly, we're engaging with our partners. So I'd like to just acknowledge that some of the folks in our audience may have a great deal of knowledge on these topics while others are just getting their first exposure. So please bear with us as we serve everyone's needs. Obviously, this work is in progress for everyone, and as questions come up, please use the chat function to submit them today. At a future time, we also expect to take a deeper dive into a couple of topics we won't cover much today. One is mitigation, and the other one is how we will be changing the way our state highway system is planned and programmed. And I'm referring there specifically to projects. So, what's going on with the implementation? So Caltrans has a role in both, as I mentioned, land use and transportation projects. The department's local development intergovernmental review process looks at the potential impacts of local development projects on the state highway system. For these projects, cities and counties are usually the lead agency, with the department acting as a commenting or responsible agency within CEQA. For transportation projects on the state highway, the department generally serves as the lead agency responsible for the CEQA review. The changes that will come with the implementation of SB 743 are fundamental, since a VMT significance metric in CEQA calls attention to the impact of land development and capacity adding transportation projects on the amount of driving in the state. And that's really one of the key takeaways what SB 743 is trying to address. So let's talk a little bit about some key implementation topics. As I already stated, SB 743, when chaptered back in 2013, directed a change in the way the environmental reviews per the Environmental Quality Act will be performed for both land use and transportation projects. Automobile delay is no longer considered an impact. Vehicle miles traveled, rather than level of service, offers a better metric in identifying project impact. Also recognized is the phenomena of induced travel. That is, the travel caused by adding roadway capacity. And additionally, changes with streamlining land use projects that align with smart growth principles is also embedded in the law and the guidelines. And something to keep in mind, the focus is on passenger travel, not on goods movement. So what does this all mean for how Caltrans changes its way of doing business? With these changes to the CEQA guidelines, the following thing will happen. Caltrans, when reviewing land use projects, is now looking for the first time at comprehensive travel impacts. Formerly, our practice was to focus on automobile level of service. We assessed how many additional vehicle trips would be generated by a project, and we would determine how those trips would affect the operation of existing transportation facilities, especially intersections and interchanges where access to and from the state highway occurs. Upon determining likely impacts, mitigations often emphasized adding vehicular capacity, whether to a ramp to process vehicles or to an intersection by adding a turn lane, for example. What got much less attention was the impact on pedestrians, cyclists, and transit patrons. So while automobile flows and speeds were being addressed, there were at times unintended negative consequences for other travel modes by making it harder to walk, cycle, or access transit. Therefore, level of service did not serve us well as the primary metric when analyzing impacts. Additionally, when LOS degradation was identified as a project impact, many urban infill projects were overburdened by extensive costs to prepare complex traffic studies and to implement mitigations to address those impacts. So then shifting to transportation projects on the state highway, the focus of evaluation had been on providing sufficient capacity to accommodate vehicular travel demand and providing operations at specified levels of service. So as a result, many capacity increasing projects have been delivered that have resulted in short-term improved travel time reliability and person throughput, while not necessarily reducing traffic congestion overall in the longer term. Not directly assessed at all were the vehicle miles traveled increases as a result of the project or the induced vehicle travel demand caused by the project. Additional vehicle miles traveled result in more greenhouse gas emissions and can lead to more sprawl development and negative public health outcomes as well. So then, what changes in CEQA guidelines specifically for land use projects? So going forward, projects in low VMT areas are presumed to have a less than significant impact. Automobile delay is no longer considered a significant impact. All agencies can rely upon the OPR technical advisory to implement the VMT metric. And many cities, as I've mentioned, have already done so. And these can serve as examples to other jurisdictions. Caltrans will continue to post those materials on our SB 743 website to share those with you if you're interested. So, vehicle miles traveled, VMT, is generally now the most appropriate measure to evaluate transportation impacts. So keep that in mind, and local agencies are required to use VMT for making transportation impact determinations for local land use projects by July 1st of 2020. And transportation impacts related to air quality, noise, safety must still be analyzed in CEQA as well. So for transportation projects, what changed? The key CEQA guideline changes and provisions require that vehicle miles traveled is generally seen as the most appropriate measure. Projects that reduce VMT are presumed to have less than significant impact. And for roadway capacity increasing projects, agency may choose the appropriate measure to determine the impact. Within those guidelines, Caltrans has determined that VMT is in fact the best measure, and we have adopted VMT as the measure of significance for projects on the state highway system. One additional point that regional partners have asked about is the following. Lead agencies may use tiering for transportation projects. This is an exciting possibility and increasingly likely when program-level environmental documents are prepared with tiering in mind. So it may make it easier for some projects to be implemented. So what specific Caltrans guidance documents are actually being developed? Caltrans is developing guidance documents for two types of projects. And I know I may be repetitive, but I'll say it again: land use projects and transportation projects. For the review of local land use projects under our Local Development Intergovernmental Review function, we are developing the Transportation Impact Study Guide, TISG. The new guide will replace the 2002 version. For transportation projects on the state highway system being delivered either by Caltrans or our partner agencies, we're developing the Transportation Analysis Framework, or also known as the TAF, which will assist practitioners with the means and methods to calculate VMT and induced travel demand. The Transportation Analysis under CEQA document, also known as TAC, will provide guidance on how to make the transportation impact determination. We are also aligning this new guidance with the recently released guidance for making the greenhouse gas emissions impact determination. And finally, we have a parallel effort underway to develop practitioner resources for both VMT and GHG mitigations. We will be putting out these materials and recognize that our partners are also working on the same. Future collaboration is essential for all of us, so we look forward to getting your comments as we put those documents out. So some key points that we will be including in our guidance documents. We emphasize that we support the use of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research Technical Advisory, both by local agencies and for our partners and ourselves for transportation projects. We also recognize the use of the VMT metric as the best primary metric for determining transportation impacts on the state highway system, and recognizing that induced travel needs to be addressed. We also recognize the need to align the technical approaches for both the greenhouse gas and transportation impact analysis. It's very important to have consistent findings with consistent data. And then fourth, linking our CEQA significance determination with the overall California Resource Board scoping plan, as I mentioned earlier, which is really the blueprint for how we're going to reach our greenhouse gas emissions and climate change goals in the future. And then lastly, we also want to make sure that our guidance is clear about not overburdening infill affordable housing projects with mitigation costs. So for the TISG and our review of local land use projects, we will change Caltrans' land use review process, leading with this new version of the TISG. The draft we're working on supports the use of the OPR technical advisory by local agencies. Our review of land use projects will focus on project VMT. We may approach reviews differently for areas with low VMT since projects in those areas are intended to be streamlined. Caltrans will focus our review on how new land use projects meet the spirit and intent of the VMT reductions identified in the OPR technical advisory. We will be looking not just at VMT forecasts, but at project elements that support lower VMT, ranging from the number of parking spaces to floor area ratio. Predictions of low VMT are not adequate unless they are backed by the features that support a move away from auto dependency. So we'll be looking for those and for the local agency's assessment of those. We want to avoid overburdening infill and affordable housing projects, as I mentioned previously, with costly analysis, but if Caltrans issues an encroachment permit, additional non-VMT analysis may be needed, as we are the CEQA responsible agency when a permit is needed. So then for projects on the state highway system relative to the various requirements, what are we doing there and what's our intent? The changes required by SB 743 depart from earlier practice by changing the basis of the evaluation in the transportation impact assessment under CEQA. Caltrans will be implementing SB 743 through the use of vehicle miles traveled as the primary metric to evaluate transportation impact on the transportation system, specifically on the state highway system. The use of vehicle miles traveled supports the state's policy in relation to supporting infill development and climate change by disclosing the anticipated consequences of adding capacity to the transportation system. By using VMT as a metric, Caltrans and other agencies will address the phenomenon of induced travel that occurs in the short and medium term, where there's a high demand because generally people change their driving habits to take advantage of the added roadway capacity. This widespread response to new capacity is the fundamental reason we generally unable to reduce congestion in urban areas for more than a short time after a facility is expanded. Second, we recognize the increased demand that occurs in the long term. As development patterns shift to take advantage of the available roadway capacity, this can often result in new development proposals in locations served by that new capacity. We also want to support pedestrian activity, cycling, transit use, and higher occupancy vehicle use that enable people to essentially opt out of congestion and offer benefits relative to public health, environmental impact, and climate change. So a lot of questions have been raised. What projects on the state highway system will actually be subject to these new requirements? So there are projects that will not require an induced travel analysis or the use of VMT, and that's probably the best way to define which projects are affected. These projects generally fall into four broad categories, and I'll emphasize the fact that these are broad: rehabilitation and maintenance, reconfigurations and traffic calming, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit enhancements, and non-capacity increasing safety improvements. I urge you to please refer to the OPR technical advisory for a detailed list of project types. For our Caltrans participants on this call, please be aware that given these categories, virtually all State Highway Operations Protection Program SHOP projects will not be affected. So how does VMT get analyzed? In the Project Development Transportation Analysis Framework, the TAF I mentioned, it will provide the guidance for CEQA transportation and traffic analysis for projects on the state highway system, including direction about the selection of appropriate methods for VMT analysis that will take into account induced travel. So that's really what the TAF is all about. So in terms of some TAF details, CEQA practitioners will need guidance on just how to use VMT as a central part of assessing transportation impacts. The department will be releasing the TAF to provide this guidance. It will identify how VMT for both induced travel demand and total project VMT should be calculated and assessed. The TAF will include elasticity-based and travel demand model-based methodologies. We will also address situations when qualitative analysis is appropriate. Examples to demonstrate the use of the TAF guidance will also be included to make it easier to be applied. We recognize there are challenges to implementation, and that's quite evident. We look forward to the input from local and regional partners on this new VMT guidance when it's made available to you. So then, in the transportation analysis under CEQA guidance, what is that all about? One of the most frequently asked questions we get is about when VMT will need to be used to make a CEQA impact determination for projects on the state highway system. Caltrans has been determining the most appropriate date to begin using VMT. We are very sensitive to the effect on the CEQA steps that are already underway, and while also needing to apply the VMT analysis in a timely manner. So Caltrans intends to have further discussions with on-system project sponsors to set a date in the near future. Per the TAC, CEQA significance determinations will follow traditional practice. The key new impact being analyzed is the project-induced vehicle travel demand. That is essentially the transportation impact that we're trying to identify with these new measures. Mitigations will be required to address the increases in VMT. It is recognized that project-level mitigations are currently a big challenge. While we will not be setting thresholds of significance, but we will be relying on substantial evidence in making our significance determination. The inability to ultimately fully mitigate project VMT may also result in the need to adopt findings of overriding consideration. Guidance for doing so will also be included in the TAC. So a few more specifics about the exact CEQA impact analysis approach that we're outlining in the TAC. In documenting the CEQA impact analysis in the TAC, our guidance will rely upon the OPR technical advisory and the CEQA guidelines, and will be consistent with state climate goals and the CARB scoping plan. Projects with potential to increase VMT will generally require quantitative analysis. And as a reminder, direction on the tools that should be used for making these quantitative analysis will be provided in the TAF. If an elasticity-based calculator is utilized for transportation impacts, then the guidance will discuss the consideration of how to reconcile those outputs with the outputs of traffic analysis used for other technical studies, such as air quality and noise. With the CEQA significance determination methodology, the CEQA guideline states that for projects that reduce or have no impact on VMT, these will generally be considered less than significant. Those that increase VMT will have significant impacts. The TAC will discuss how to compare the various TAF outputs, including current and future VMT levels, for both build and no build to determine significance. So, how do we mitigate for VMT impacts? One of the keys here is to explore compatible VMT and GHG mitigation measures, documenting those measures to reduce VMT, and to the maximum extent feasible, identifies measures that can be implemented. These could include strategies to support mode shift, higher vehicle occupancy, shorter average vehicle trips, and transportation demand management strategies. The process may result in the need for a statement of overriding considerations if full mitigation cannot be achieved. So as I mentioned, standard CEQA practice is being used. VMT impact mitigation is hard, and CT, that's Caltrans, is pursuing and committed to developing robust mitigation strategies, and we hope to roll some of those out in the near future and have further conversations. What I'd like to emphasize today is that Caltrans District and the regional partners, especially for these projects on the state highway system, will need to partner to develop mitigation approaches. These could include use of mitigation banks and exchanges, and we will hope to develop some guidance for doing so. So then, what are some of the next steps in terms of the Caltrans guidance documents? We continue our collaborative process with our project partners here to develop the guidance, which includes the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and our partners at the California Resource Board. We will also continue to engage to hear from our partners around the state as we work on this effort through informal conversations and presentations. We will also make the draft documents available in early 2020, and we're committed to having a fairly long review period of approximately 4 weeks, during which time we will also hold additional webinars. We hope and expect to release the final guidance documents in the late spring to early summer of 2020. And as I mentioned, additional webinars covering each of the topics in each of the guidance documents will be scheduled soon, and everyone participating today will be invited. We've also set up a dedicated email address for people to send questions to. The new address is on your screen, sb743.implementation@dot.ca.gov. Okay, so what are some key takeaways from all of this? More than 500 people registered for the webinar today, and the latest count is 440, and I missed the bet on how many people would participate. Shame on me. And frankly, a lot of our Caltrans colleagues are also on the line to stay informed and up to date. We have representatives from cities, counties, transportation agencies, and plenty of consultants on the call. All are very eager to learn how this will affect the work we all do. As you absorb the materials from today, you will undoubtedly have additional questions. The changes for SB 743 are profound and will challenge the state of the practice for all of us. So please consider, what will change in the way you do your current work? How will it impact the community you live in and how we plan and evaluate projects? So when does all this really go into effect? As a reminder, for land use projects, no later than July 1st of 2020. For transportation projects on the state highway system, as soon as Caltrans sets the date. As I mentioned, we'll be discussing that with our partners in the near future. So please remember that for transportation projects not on the state highway system, the local jurisdiction decides if and when to use VMT as its metric for making these determinations. So how can you be prepared for the changes in the implementation guidance that's coming forward? Stay in touch. We will be sending presentation materials and answers to post questions to all participants after the webinar today, and we will be scheduling future webinars. We are still in progress and require substantial interagency coordination, and we all have to move at the same pace. I hope the presentation has provided you some general information and some specific direction. As we move through the questions we received today, we'll provide additional detail where we can. So with that, I thank you, and we will turn over the question and answer session to Joan to walk us through the questions that we've received. So stand by while we shuffle around to do that.
Okay, so everyone, if you could just hang on the line for a moment. We have a few more Caltrans subject matter experts that are going to join us to help us respond to the number of questions that are coming in through the chat. We're going to try and group them to eliminate duplicates. And so my team is coming in. And so we have a screen full of questions here. And we'll see if the team is ready to help advise and share, start to supplement some of the information that Chris Schmidt provided earlier. So let's start with some questions here.
Is there anything that stands out to the team? We've received quite a few, so
see, we have a question about the TAF. I know you spoke to that, Chris. Just wondering if we can add anything to that statement. That one came in pretty quickly.
Which one? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, we just need a second here to process and digest the variety of questions that have come in. And obviously, we're not going to be able to answer all of these today, but we will supplement where we can. Okay, I think we.
So one of the questions that I see: will methodologies be consistent across Caltrans districts? And the answer to that is yes. That is our intent. One of the keys that we've been discussing throughout is making sure that the methods that are applied throughout the state by the district is consistent. So that is the intent of the guidance, and our guidance will likely be fairly explicit about that to make sure that there is a sense of consistency everywhere throughout the state. I think there was a question about overriding considerations and how that might be done. So to be really clear, when you document that your project has a VMT significant impact, you will be asked to mitigate to the greatest extent feasible per CEQA requirements. And at times you're going to see that the ability to mitigate those impacts will be difficult. As a result, if you want the project to go forward and have a CEQA clearance, you're going to need to adopt findings of overriding consideration. Our guidance will help folks and practitioners determine how to make that determination and how to justify that determination. It is essentially very similar to making any finding of overriding consideration. So we're getting a lot of questions that vary between, transportation and land use. So and I'm going to apologize for jumping around a little bit back and forth, but let me answer a couple here. One has to do with infill projects and how those are going to be reviewed by the department. We have a keen eye on what are basically identified in the Office of Planning and Research Technical Advisory as low VMT areas, or areas where we have robust transit service. In those locations, our project reviews will focus really on making sure that the right projects are going into those locations and that they are in fact, as intended, low VMT. and that our evaluation will be focusing predominantly on making sure that that's the case. There are direct and indirect effects from those projects, and we've discussed how to deal with those indirect effects. One thing that I'll message on in general is that when projects go into those low VMT areas, we generally get better outcomes in terms of overall roadway safety, as well as overall reductions in VMT. And that's really the key benefit that we all see from infill development in those areas. And there's also a recognition that those projects do need to be designed well, and to the extent that they interface with local streets and roads or the state highway system, we also want to make sure that they're appropriately meeting design standards so that the safety of all roadway users can be assured. So one question here is about threshold. I don't know if Jeremy, do you want to address thresholds a little bit in terms of the fact that we're using substantial evidence rather than setting explicit thresholds, and that will apply regardless of whether Caltrans is the project proponent or one of our regional partners?
Sure. So yes, there's a specific process to go through to set thresholds. That process is not being undertaken in this case. However, we will be looking at general practices that are utilized in our CEQA significance determinations currently to determine significance, which includes, as Chris mentioned in his presentation, to look at various scenarios between no build, build, and analysis years to look at the impact of, in this case, being induced demand and what that change is on each project, whether it's increasing or decreasing due to the project.
Okay. There's a couple of questions here about the type of non-VMT analysis that may be requested. So in general, if a Caltrans encroachment permit is required, we may ask you for traditional evaluations relative to making sure that the project permit can be issued to meet specific design specifications, et cetera. So that's what I'm referring to there. So if, for example, you want to signalize an intersection or you're going to stop control it, we might need additional information to see if a signal warrant is met, a stop warrant is met, and how the exact geometrics are being proposed for that improvement. So one of the questions here is about tiering projects for local agencies. That's always been a possibility, and I think going forward, one of the things that we're cognizant to is the fact that a lot of the projects that are being delivered are already embedded in other plans. And if those plans have gone through a robust CEQA process with an eye towards tiering, then projects that fall underneath that plan potentially could be tiered from. So many agencies have not taken full advantage of that, and there are obviously complexities in tiering off of programmatic documents, but we definitely see an opportunity for doing so, and we'll continue to explore that. So if you're interested in that, we definitely want to work with you on that. I also see a question here about induced demand assumption in rural areas. That is something that we've heard about already, and we've had some discussions about that. In general, the phenomenon of induced demand is something that is most concerning in urbanized areas where there is existing congestion. And so where there's existing congestion and additional roadway capacity is provided, that additional capacity is usually fully utilized over a relatively short period of time. In rural areas, we don't really see the same level of congestion, but we are all sensitive to the fact that there may be occasionally, or in some spot locations, congestion perhaps at a rural intersection where two main streets come together or something like that. So those are issues that we will be grappling with as we go forward. So please stay tuned and do raise the issue with us as we continue.
And there's a number of questions coming through about getting the answers to all of the questions, and they will be provided after the webinar. So we'll consolidate all of the questions and answers will be issued, but we will be answering whatever we can during the time we have today.
Yeah. So there's a question here from one of our Caltrans folks about shop projects. When I said it generally does not apply to the shop, that is correct. If the shop project is capacity increasing in nature by virtue of being an operational project, it may be subject to this requirement. So it really will be subject to the nature of the project, and we'll go through the typical environmental screening process that we put all our projects through. Who are some of the stakeholders that you're talking with over the next few months? Well, we're doing a lot of stakeholder meetings at kind of the higher executive level. So we've had some meetings already with leadership from the metropolitan planning organizations. We will be talking to the leadership of the self-help counties later this month. And we continue to have meetings and discussions with various advocate groups that have also contacted us. This webinar and subsequent webinars are also your opportunity. And then the email address that we posted is another way for you to be involved with us. So we're doing some reactive outreach as a result of you contacting us, and some proactive outreach as we go out and seek folks we know are going to be affected and have a lot of questions. There's a question here about the TISG and what will it address? Will it address operational and safety concern, and how will these be characterized? So this is one of the most sticky issues that we've always been dealing with. Is, as I mentioned earlier, we will be focusing in our TISG guide on the vehicle miles traveled impact from projects. The department certainly is concerned about overall roadway safety, and we are developing some guidance to also assess that. But we want to make sure that that's done in a very focused manner based on the actual safety issues that we're concerned with. So the TISG will provide some guidance on how to do that. So there's a question here about who generally performs the VMT analysis on a state highway project. Well, we've got a number of different ways that projects on the state highway system are delivered today. So in some cases, Caltrans is the lead agency in doing all of the work. In other cases, that work is done by regional partners and consultants. So fundamentally, the work can be done by whomever is doing the technical studies, and they would be following the guidance that we're going to be issuing. So there's a question here about mitigation banks and some thoughts about that. Well, fundamentally, VMT mitigation is not that easy to do. And one of the things we've been talking about is really the need to stand up robust VMT reducing projects that can ultimately be used to reduce and perhaps offset VMT from projects. That's something that is best done at a more regional level rather than at a project level. And the reason I mentioned mitigation banks or exchanges, it's a way to essentially set up protocols where or by which you can take credit for VMT reductions you're making in one spot and perhaps VMT increases you're making somewhere else. What I want to drive home here, though, is we have to have overall VMT reductions over time. So while these banks and exchanges can work extremely well to make sure those steps are taken, we also have to have an eye on overall VMT reduction.
There were questions about the encroachment permit.
In terms of traditional reviews within encroachment permits done separately from CEQA. Well, one of the things that we all need to recognize is that there are design standards that local jurisdictions and Caltrans all abide by, and then there are CEQA processes. So the key is when the project impact requires a permit, what part of that permit approval is really subject to CEQA in the first place? If there are simple design issues involved with a typical encroachment permit that doesn't necessarily trigger a CEQA determination, could be exempt. And so it really depends on the nature of the improvement and what sort of evaluation you'll have to do under CEQA. So every circumstance, every project, every permit is unique, but as part of our permit process, there is a CEQA compliance component. So there will be a determination made at that point. So there's some questions about sort of the timing. So just remind everyone that what we're developing for the guidelines internally for our procedures, we're targeting to do all of that by the spring of 2020. We're literally in the midst of drafting a lot of these documents, and we will then be wanting to make those available for review. There was also a related question about who's involved and how can I be more involved. I think we are eager to get CEQA practitioners and transportation practitioners more deeply involved and have some discussions about how to do that. So we may form some additional teams and do some additional focused outreach to folks that are also doing this throughout the state, perhaps at the regional and municipal level with partners, et cetera. So a question in rural areas, and this is one of the complicated issues in terms of, you know, separating safety and the need to do safety projects from creating capacity and perhaps having that capacity being viewed as induced demand driving. So we want to be really clear, projects that really have a key safety component and are, you know, that the scope essentially of the project is to improve safety, while perhaps at the same time adding capacity. Some kind of a determination has to be made about whether or not that additional capacity will induce demand. It may also induce additional growth or redirect trips to various facilities. So some sort of an assessment would be required. I don't want to give the sense here that especially in rural areas where there are needs for certain safety improvements to be made, that using VMT would necessarily stand in the way of those improvements. It's recognized that in a lot of the rural areas, you know, increases in VMT is less likely in terms of induced travel because we really don't have the same congested conditions in the first place. So that's an area of focus that we'll put more guidance together as part of our task to address that more clearly. Or will there be future training? Absolutely. If we've learned nothing through this process so far, and as I said before, this is a profound change in the way we're going to be conducting the various analysis that our guidance provides. We're going to need to do training to our own staff, and we need to do training to all of you who are going to try to put this material into practice. So we will do webinars both to, you know, explain and get feedback on the guidance as we develop it, but then we're also developing a robust training plan and figuring out how to roll that out.
You already responded to this one.
Yeah.
Can you answer this one?
Yes. So one of the questions, you know, I'll try to answer it broadly. One of the questions is about timing and what if I'm using older data to start on the project, and when do I become subject to this, and when will my review be affected? You know, I think in general, starting July 2020, you know, local jurisdictions are going to be using VMT, and we will be focusing our review on those VMT assessments. If you're doing a transportation project and you've been working on this perhaps and initiated a number of years ago, we're also keen to understand what the timing of implementation of VMT is for those projects, so that we don't ask for costly rework. So all of that is being factored in, but really it is very different for land use projects than it is for land use transportation projects. For land use projects, it will be required starting July 1st, 2020. And for transportation projects in the state highway system, we will be setting a specific date as to when that becomes necessary, recognizing, you know, previous work may have already been started for some projects. So I think we've exhausted a lot of the questions that we can easily answer. We've skipped some of the more complicated ones that are kind of hard to answer verbally here. But we definitely want to thank you for your questions, and we'll just remind you that this material will be sent to you as a participant, hopefully early next week. We will both post the recorded version of this webinar so you can re-listen to it. You will also get a copy of the presentation itself, and you will get responses to each of the questions that were posed today. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and look forward to continuing to engage with you. With that, we'll sign off. Thank you.